Welcome to Economic Development and Democracy Week, and we're really just looking at one key question today. That is, does economic development lead to democracy? We often think that there is some sort of relationship that's happening between a country growing its economy and democratizing, so let's parse out that relationship, see what we find. I don't know if there's going to be one video today or two. We'll see if I can go plug right all the way through, because what we're going to do is go through some of the key theories, the key academic debates that have happened on this question, and then we'll walk through the Development and Democracy article by DeMesquita and Downs. So either in one video or two, we'll see how I'm doing by the time we get to that. All right, so it's this big question, right? Does economic development lead to democracy? So let's look at some of the initial theories that came about this question. So on the question, on the side of the spectrum saying yes, economic development does lead to democracy, first we have Lipset. So in 1959, he writes this book called The Political Man. I still cite it sometimes because it's kind of this classic theory that modernization leads to democracy. So he finds, he's the first to find this strong relationship between levels of development and incidences of democratic regimes. And so what he says happens is that as societies industrialize, more people are moving into cities for work. They become more educated. We call that cognitive mobilization. So they have more education, more ability to think through important concepts. They can communicate easier with each other, and because of this, they will start to want to demand some say in how they're being governed, how their money's being used, how the money that's resulted from this urbanization, from this industrialization, how is that being used? How is that going to be used in government? And then they'll want to have a bit of a say on how leaders are selected too, because they're invested in this process of industrialization. And so essentially he sees this as a step from industrialization leads to urbanization, because you have people working in factories, not at farms. Then because they're in cities, they have access to higher levels of education, that then they're going to become more cognitively mobilized. Therefore, they're going to demand democracy. And so this is what we call an endogenous effect, so like endogenous democratization. And endogenous is just a fancy term for coming from within. So democracy is coming from within the country and from within the people, and is being demanded of by the people because of this modernization and this increase in wealth. Okay, so I guess the question then is, what problems could we see with this theory? So have a think about that question. So I can think of three main problems we might find with this theory. First of all is this linear idea that everyone is just progressing pretty clearly from non-democratic regimes to democratic regimes, that it's a linear progression. And we know that movement towards democracy and away from democracy is not really as linear as we've always thought it is. We learned that last class. The other problem one could see is that it suggests that people are too dumb for democracy before industrialization. And it suggests that you need to have a certain level of intellect and education in order to be democratic. And we know that there are people who have very little education, who, still deserve to live in a democratic state. So, is there a certain threshold of education or cognitive mobilization required for democracy? Is it only something that people can handle if they have a certain level of knowledge or skill or cognitive skills? So that's one other kind of potentially problematic thing about this Lipset theory. And then the last thing is we talked about this in methods, that correlation does not equal causation. So we notice that these two things are going together. We've noticed, yes, economic development and democracy are tending to rise together at the same time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. It does not necessarily mean that greater economic development is the thing that is causing democracy to develop. So 10 years later, or a little less than 10 years later, Samuel Huntington, we've talked about him before. He writes a book, Political Order in Changing Societies, and he says economic development and political stability are two independent goals and progress towards one has no necessary connection with progress toward the other. All right, so he says, yes, modernization is increasing political participation, but unfortunately, it is doing that before people have learned how to associate with each other. And because of that, it's going to cause instability. And that instability is not particularly helpful for the democratic movement. So he's really trying to demonstrate that political and institutional development is lagging behind political participation, and the result is this instability. So here's a quote from him. He says, "The primary problem is not liberty, but the creation of a legitimate public order. Men may, of course, have order without liberty, but they cannot have liberty without order." So he says instability created by modernization is antithetical to democracy. So why is this? So first of all, modernization is producing a great amount of wealth. It's going to create a new money class, so people who now suddenly have money and want power and status that reflect their wealth. And there'll be a growing gap oftentimes between the rich and the poor, and that's going to cause a lot of tension. Also, the fact that, as economic development happens in a country, incomes are not going to rise for everyone, and that causes dissatisfaction, and that, of course, we know causes instability. You're also going to get the replacement of traditional authorities by some sort of single national authority, and government becomes kind of the product of man, and all of the associated problems with that. And I say man as in like humans. And really, there's no kind of authority or legitimacy sometimes with that single national authority that people are so willing to respect. You'll also see an increased organizational capacity of groups to make demands on the government, and if the government is unable to satisfy those demands, you can get some pretty unstable, some pretty good instability, because you have groups that are now demanding things that they can't necessarily have fulfilled. You'll also see an erosion of identity. So there's this growth of group consciousness that has an integrating effect, but also disintegrating effect. So integrating within group, but disintegrating without group, so outside of your group. So it creates prejudices and conflicts between groups, but be that because of resources, one city versus another city, one geographic area, center versus periphery. We'll talk about key cleavages later. But there's going to be a competition between groups for resources, where there's any sort of inequality of economic development in different areas, where there's any sort of unequal distribution of power. You're going to have some aggravated conflict, between different groups. Some other things that'll happen is if you have increased geographic mobility, which often comes from modernization, people moving into the city, people don't have the same sort of social ties that they used to. And that can lead to some political extremism, because if you are a young person suddenly living in a city, you're outside of your traditional structures, you're looking for something to believe in, something to be part of. And so that's why we see some radicalization, or at least political extremism. And the final thing, I think, is that you can get increased literacy by this modernization theory, sure, so you get this cognitive mobilization. But with that, if aspiration levels are beyond what can actually be provided at that time, if people start demanding things that can't be provided, it can really just cause an explosion, of people being dissatisfied with government. And so for Huntington, he says modernization creates instability, and instability is antithetical to democracy. So stop thinking that economic development is always going to lead to democracy, and instead, why not consider the fact that it actually might be destabilizing? All right, so those guys are writing in the 50s and 60s. So what's the state of this debate today? So it's still debated. There's kind of not one clear answer. And we're going to look at some more recent articles, both in class and during this video lecture, that we'll talk a little bit more about where current scholarship is moving on this issue of, does economic development equal democracy? So, on the no side of things, George Jaworski and Limongi write this article, Modernization Theories and Facts. And they argue that actually development helps democracy survive, but it does not cause it. So there is a correlation between democracy and development. I mean, you can see that in this graph right here. And so they say, okay, well, what might be going on here? So the first thing that could be happening is, yes, that democracies might be more likely to emerge as countries develop economically. So that would be the Lipset hypothesis, this endogenous coming from within argument. Or it could be that that democracy is being established independent of economic development, but that it is more likely to survive in developed countries. And surprise, surprise, this is what they think is happening. So democracies are established independently of economic development. So that could be wars or foreign pressure. We call this an exogenous argument, so something that is coming from without, so it's coming from outside. Whereas endogenous is coming from within the country. And economic development can still play a role, but it may actually be that it's just helping democracy survive in these sort of more developed, richer countries. But the catalyst, remember, is not the development itself. The development is just giving the conditions that it's going to survive. And so the numbers then show that development actually increases the likelihood of stability. But it has to be development, not just being rich. So it's not just about wealth. Oftentimes we think about, a lot of really, really wealthy, say Middle Eastern countries, for example, that have a lot of oil wealth, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But they don't seem to be democratizing. And so the question is less about the amount of wealth. It's more about, is the society actually modernizing and developing? And so for Jaworski and Limongi, the key take home is that democracy is not an inevitability. It's about actions. It's not about predetermined things. And yes, development, especially economic development, can help democracy survive, but it's not going to be causing democratization. So this was Jaworski and Limongi, and then Box and Stokes write a kind of rebuttal to that. And they retest Jaworski and Limongi's findings, and they say, hey, wait a second, actually something a little bit different is happening. So they find that in poor and middle-income countries at least, whether the status quo is democracy or dictatorship, economic growth increases the incentives for the ruling faction to democratize. And so this likelihood of a transition to democracy and that this democracy will be sustained is actually more likely in these countries that are developing. So they say, don't discount this idea of an endogenous effect of development on democracy. So this idea of democracy coming from within. Don't discount that. It might still actually be happening. And this is still something that scholars continue to debate and discuss. And so let's look at two quite recent articles. One we'll look at now, and then the next we'll look at in class. So we'll go over the resource course really quickly, but we are going to do this in class. So I really like this Ross article, really well written. And so he asks the question, as the title suggests, does oil hinder democracy? So it's a kind of a more specific example of this taking place. And essentially he starts with this idea that there's this relationship between wealth and democracy, but it doesn't seem to be happening when countries owe their wealth to oil. So it doesn't mean that oil wealth is actually going to hinder democratic development. And he says, maybe it's not just in the Middle East, and maybe it's not just oil, but other minerals too. So he goes out to test this in a very scientific way. He suggests three things might be going on in terms of why he thinks that oil might be hindering democracy or oil wealth is preventing the rise of democracy. So the first is this idea of rentier effects. It's the idea that resource-rich governments can use low tax rates and patronage and spending on all sorts of things for their people to relieve pressures for greater accountability. So, you can think of an example of, I don't really have a democratic government, but my tax rates are low, and my government just built this amazing, just hosted a big Olympics, for example, or hosted the FIFA World Cup. So I guess it's okay that we don't have such big accountability. I guess it's fine, and so we call this the rentier effect. The other option, he says, is and which could be working in tandem, is the repression effect. So the idea that resource wealth slows democratization because it enables governments to boost their funding for internal security. So if you have a lot of money that you're getting from your oil wealth, you can have a really strong military and really strong police that is supporting you and making sure that nobody is suggesting that they're going to be in opposition. It's much easier to repress people if you have the money to pay for it. And then the final idea is this modified form of the modernization thesis. So the idea that the growth based on export of minerals and oil, doesn't bring about the kind of social and cultural changes that we saw in the modernization thesis. It doesn't bring about these sort of industrialization, education, and therefore people demanding democracy, because it's a very different type. Resource extraction is a very different type of industrialization or modernization. And so he goes out and tests these theories, and so you're going to be taking a look at this in class, and going to be going through kind of with a fine-tooth comb to understand how he goes about testing this theory, because it's something that we see in the world today and still remains quite debated. The other article that I wanted you to take a look at this week is the De Mesquita and Downs, Development and Democracy. So what I want you to do is pause this video. There are 6 discussion questions that I'd like you to have a think about, and then I am going to walk through the article kind of like what we did for the Crothers transition paradigm article. So give the article a pause, make sure you've read it, make sure you've thought about the discussion questions, and then we'll move over to the article. So let's close this, bring this one up. It's better. All right, so hopefully, welcome back. Looks like we're going to plow all the way through and take a look at this article. So this was written in Foreign Affairs, which is maybe a little bit more of a public-facing publication than traditional journal articles, but still really well written by 2 very important scholars in the field. So let's take a look at what they're arguing. So they're also looking at this question of, is there a relationship between economic development and democracy? So they start off with this example of China. That's kind of what causes what is the Kickstarter for this, is that, China has all of this economic growth, and we just kind of assumed that political reform would follow, that it would eventually democratize. But it never happened. And so why didn't it happen? And that's kind of one of the reasons that De Mesquita and Downs are writing. And so they essentially rehash the modernization thesis. So the argument in the simplest form is economic development produces educated and entrepreneurial middle class that sooner or later begins to demand control. Okay. So there's the modernization thesis, this idea of Lipset that economic development is going to lead to democracy. And they say, okay, well, we thought so because it seemed like all the richest countries were democratic. But now we're starting to notice that a lot of countries that are getting very rich are really just not democratizing. So the example, of course, being China, Russia, examples where you see greater industrialization, you see greater economic development, but you're not seeing this sort of democratization that we thought we'd find. And noticing this pattern that, where is it, right here, that it seems like that governments can be developing and autocrats seem to be staying in power, despite the fact that we get all of this economic development. And they say, okay, well, why is this the case? And they say, Well, authoritarian regimes are getting better at avoiding the political fallout of economic growth. So it's about authoritarian regimes or autocrats or dictators being very smart about their industrialization, about their economic development. And so this article is seeking to figure out how are they being smart? What are they doing that is allowing them to grow economically without any of these effects of democratization? So they give a few examples of how economic growth can be good and bad for an autocrat. So the first, okay, well, why would economic growth be great if you're a dictator or an autocrat? Well, first, you get more money and you can pay off people. So it's just like what we saw with the rentier effect or also the repression effect with the Ross article, that if you have more money, you can keep yourself in power a lot longer. And it also, with this rentier effect that we saw in the Ross article, it makes people less likely to complain. If you are comfortable and you are not hungry, you are probably less likely to take to the streets and risk your life to get democratic rule in your country. Generally, people who aren't hungry don't tend to like to get killed. So for autocrats, economic development can be a really good thing. Now, the problem, of course, is that it can also become a bad thing for your authoritarian regime. You can start to have the influence of many more competitors for power. Why? Because there's more spoils available, so there's a growing amount of wealth and more people want that access to that wealth. And then also that there will be the growth of more people who are capable of challenging your rule, especially if more people are getting educated, if more people are getting their own wealth. Then they might say, hey, wait a second, like this autocrat seems to have all of the power. Maybe I'd like a little bit of that too because, I'm just as smart as him or her and I have my own, political support, so they'll start vying for power as well. So what do you do if you're an autocrat and you want to keep your power while also developing economically? So what you want to do is you want to limit strategic coordination. So strategic coordination is control of things like information, of influence to policy. And essentially, where is it? Right here, refers to the set of the set of activities that people must engage in to win political power in a given situation. All right, so you want to be able then to limit what strategic coordination your opposition is able to do. And so you're going to want to limit the ability of them to coordinate. You're going to want to limit their ability to work together, to organize, so that nobody can really threaten your regime. So what does that look like then practically? So they give examples. So China, for example, the Great Firewall, as we say, blocking access to certain Google search terms, limiting internet activity so that people can't be organizing on the internet as well as they would need to in order to challenge. There we go. To challenge China's current regime. You see this in Russia, where television stations are under government control. You see in Venezuela, under Chavez government, banning certain news reports of times when the government is repressing certain protests. You can see the limiting of religious groups or religious organizations. Again, another way to ensure that people are not organizing, that they're not coordinating. And so that's what they say is a restriction of what is called these coordination goods. These goods, here we go, that affect the ability of political opponents to coordinate, but that really have very little impact on economic growth. So you can still be growing economically, but you are limiting the ways that any potential opponents are able to access power. So let's just move down here. And so generally what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to crack down on those who might rise up as opposition. And one of the best ways to do that is to restrict public goods. So things like political rights, press freedoms, human rights, higher education. And you can do all of that while still growing, having your economy grow. And this way you can ensure that your opposition or your potential opposition isn't going to be able to coordinate to take you down. So right over here. So Demskita and Downs did a study to test for this idea, and they find evidence of their key points. First, that if you suppress coordination goods or the ability to organize, and if you do it consistently, you can have high economic growth while remaining an authoritarian regime. And so then they say, okay, well then, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for policymakers, for practitioners, for people who are really invested in increasing democracy? And the take-home message is really, first, that economic growth does not necessarily lead to democracy. We often think, well, as long as countries are growing economically, eventually, inevitably, they'll get to democracy. And that is definitely not the case. The second thing is, so if you're looking at foreign aid to help economic growth, and helping for building infrastructure, you actually might be helping an autocrat survive, because it's providing people the sort of comfort that allows them not to rise up, and it kind of just supports the authoritarian regime. So instead, what you need to be doing is insisting on coordination goods when you are giving them loans for economic development, when you're giving aid. Really insisting that people be able to coordinate, that they be able to have these public goods that allow them to have a variety of different parties, to have a variety of different options. And once those options exist, then the likelihood of democracy is going to increase as well. All right, so that's essentially the kind of summary of this article. And now we're going to head over to the quiz, do the quiz, and we'll see you in class.